Hey everybody, welcome to the recorded lecture. So for today, I'm going to cover some of the concepts from the last three chapters 5 through 7 in the book. But the main thing I want y'all to do today, the main learning objective, is for y'all to complete the speculative futures exercise that I had meant to do last week, where you're looking at speculative museum exhibits and thinking about how can we imagine abolitionist futures that help us get beyond the kind of progressive imperative that we've been critiquing with this book. But in this PowerPoint, what I'm basically going to be doing is summarizing the book and pulling out a few key pieces. But I do want your emphasis, I'll do my best to keep it short, I'm not always good at that, but I want your emphasis to be on the speculative exercise. And then if you need more review to get a sense of these chapters, that's what this lecture is for. But before getting into those chapters, I just wanted to pull out this really lovely quote that illustrates the points that we've been talking about, especially last class. This idea that schools and prisons both function as enclosures of Black social, political, and cultural life. That these are institutions that are designed to depoliticize Black rage and criminalize Black joy. I think that's a really profound way of thinking about Robeson and other schools as a politics of enclosure, as an afterlife of the plantation. That is effectively a means of controlling, of enclosing, again, Black social, political, and cultural life. That's just a very precise and excellent phrase. So chapter 5 focuses on an account of this contradiction where two problematic teachers end up leaving Robeson, which is seen as a win, right? Because these are not, these are more liberal professors, more on the right wing of the school, as opposed, and not as radical, right? So it's a win to be able to get rid of the problematic students the problematic professors, teachers, who kept imposing these disciplinary practices in a very rigid way. But at the same time, you also see the expulsion of several Black girls in a way that no one really talks about. There's no ceremony in the same way the teachers have a ceremony when they leave. So if getting rid of two problematic teachers is a win, how is the expulsion of Black girls a non-event? How is it something that's unimportant? Something that doesn't need, it's not believed to be needing to be remarked upon. And this really gets at this question that I love the way Sanjay frames this, is who has to be expulsed from the institution as a kind of progressive win in order for it to continue operating. Well, I'll come back to that quote in a later point. And this goes back to a concept that she develops that I really love in this chapter, unruly Blackness. That which is, unruly Blackness is always very gendered, as she points out. And this gets at what Sanjay is calling border maintenance as an important technique of the progressive school, of the progressive state. Border maintenance is about who belongs and who decides. What kinds of dissent can be assimilated? That's a lovely way of framing this question. Whose dissent can be assimilated and who has to be expelled for the sake of this progressive win? Who has to be removed from the community of Robeson as a school? And I love this phrase of border maintenance, right? Because this also brings us to a lot of issues in terms of family detentions and border maintenance in terms of nation-state borders. And I think that there's a nice way we can think about these concepts in relationship to the not just abolish police, but abolish ICE movement. So I want to come back to this question, this concept of unruly Blackness. And this is the way, again, to adopt Sanjay's phrasing, who is unassimilatable to the multiracial political project? What kinds of practices cannot be assimilated into this practice? Who is ungovernable? And I really appreciate this concept of unruly, right? Because we're talking about, again, who is ungovernable in the sense of who is beyond the rule. I think last class we talked about the ruler in the sense of the authority, but also the system of measurement, and also the thing that you use to slap the back of students' hands when they misbehave. And this quote that Sanjay, this quote attached is really where Sanjay pulls out this contradiction between the expulsion of the students as well as the removal of the teachers. Or, I mean, it's not a removal because it's, the teachers decided to leave. But in these kinds of border maintenance, we see, while there's a lot of fanfare about teachers leaving, including a special ceremony and programming, there was no public ritual to mark the departure of the black girls from the school space. Their absence was expected and thus ungrievable. A day late and a dollar short, this chapter is kind of a ceremony in their honor, an attempt to name their all too ordinary removal or escape, and hold a space for that which is unassimilable to the multiracial political project. And so what I really love about this quote is the first part, the idea of black expulsion as being ungrievable, as being something that's unremarkable in the sense of not remarked upon, as well as ordinary, a kind of ordinary form of violence. But also the idea of ethnographic writing as a ceremony in honor of the people who have to be removed for the sake of this multiracial political project. Here we're getting, Sanjay is getting at something that we might call liberal white supremacy or multiracial white supremacy as a specific kind of project. In this slide, I pulled out a few different concepts from the book. I don't want to get that deep into them for the sake of time. I want to make sure you all have time for the speculative exercise. But the core move that I really love is this idea of seeing black girls as not just the alien outside of the state, of the progressive state or the progressive institutions, but rather the black hole at the very center of the knot that ties the world together as we know it. I did also, in terms of concepts, just very briefly, I thought the internalization of the whip was a very useful concept, the ways in which, but part of this logic of emancipation and the formal elimination of plantations has been the establishment of regimes of self-discipline, of what some people would call respectability politics. And another concept that I thought was useful was hieroglyphics of the flesh, by which she means the afterlife of torture marked on bodies. What are the afterlives of the torture of the plantation? She talks a lot about cultural vestibularity versus culture itself. Just to clarify what that word means, a vestibule is like an entryway. You can see in the picture, it's an entryway in front of a building, a sort of room that you enter into before entering into the room prior, or the building proper. And so if the vestibule is like a kind of space prior to culture, what she means is that blackness is both outside of what she's calling culture, but also this space that you're required to go through in order to get to it. It's both outside and central, both outside and core. And by culture, right, she's referring not to the way anthropologists often talk about culture or neoliberals talk about culture. Like, we're not talking about a multicultural experience. We're talking about cultural institutions. We're talking about judges, courts, police, schools, institutions. We're talking about the carceral state. She also has this phrase, black girl opacity. I want to flag that because we're going to come back to these kinds of ideas with the next book. This is this idea when one student says to her, you can follow me, but I'm not going to talk to you. And here, Sanjay articulates this real contradiction between the ethnographic imperative to know the other, to make the people she's researching transparent and knowable, versus their self-determination to be opaque. And this is what she calls a refusal. On the one hand, Tarika is refusing to participate in the ethnographic project to a certain extent. She's consenting to certain kinds of participation and refusing others. And Sanjay is refusing to try and make that opacity speak. This concept of refusal is a core concept in the next book we're going to read. And in fact, what Sanjay is doing is drawing on this book that we're going to read next to articulate this argument about black girl opacity. And I love this little point, right, that both the carceral and decolonial engagement with black women relies on making those subjects transparent. Whether it's her project as a decolonial anthropologist or the carceral state, they're both premised on the need to know black girls over black girls' own ability to self-determine. Chapter 6 opens with this beautiful poem by the Chicano movement activist and leader, Luis Valdez. And in this quote, what Sanjay is doing is she's talking about the ways in which reciting this poem becomes a kind of ritual of multiculturalism and multiracial solidarity at Robeson. And she talks about it as a kind of Black and Latinx, Chicanx solidarity that's often very fragile and tenuous. But what she points out is, if you read the text, that there's actually a political move that the school is doing that's in many ways contradictory to Valdez's vision as an activist, in which the you in the poem and the myself in the poem are already exclusive constructs. And so Sanjay asks, who is excluded by this dialogue between the you and the myself in this poem, as it's deployed by Robeson? In terms of content, this chapter is really about a brawl between Black and Chicanx students, as well as the official efforts to discipline and deal with this fight, and their efforts at reconciliation as a kind of multicultural project. And Sanjay's point here is that policing and punition form the foundation of carceral progressivism that undergirds the iteration of multi-coalition. What she means by this is that the school, as a kind of multiracial social justice project, relies on a foundation of incarceration, on policing and punition. This is the disciplining of especially Black bodies involved in this fight. And so here we see this contradiction between the multicultural and anti-racist imperatives of the school and the liberatory solidarity movements, especially from the 60s and 70s. We see, to take the example of the poem, the repurposing of this Chicano movement piece of poetry in order to serve the mission of this state institution. And it's an anti-racist state institution, and yet this logic, nevertheless, of appropriating this poem relies on being able to reproduce an exclusion between the insider and the outsider, the you and the myself that are included, and the outsider who is not included. And to go back to the concept I'd introduced in a previous slide, here we're starting to talk about liberal or multicultural white supremacy. We're talking about an us that is structured by anti-Blackness, but isn't inherently normatively white, right? So how are school officials thinking about who counts as us in a way that's very much mired in anti-Blackness, and who is outside of that construction of us or the community? How is that construction of us mired in anti-Blackness, even if the us isn't normatively white? If it can be a very diverse body of students and faculty and people who can be enrolled within this construction of the anti-Black us. And this logic hinges on a division between insiders and outsiders, right? Those on the outside of the progressive us versus those who are on the inside. Now, one of the points that Sanjay points out is that the principal, Aaron, is actually in a position of power where he's governing literally who is inside and outside by expelling students. So in his talk, he draws attention to like outsiders who are causing trouble compared to his obligations to the student body. He says that when he's pushed on it, he says that he wouldn't want police to arrest his students, but in terms of the outsiders who were present, they can crack heads. He has this very violent imagery, and it's seen as legitimate. Police violence is seen as legitimate if it's targeted towards outsiders. So we see that the people who are marked as on the outside of the school are become vulnerable to police violence, particularly as Aaron calls the police to resolve the fight. And this logic, right, as Sanjay says, is that young people of color deserve better, but apparently outsiders don't. Students of color at Robeson deserve better, but outsiders still don't deserve better than police violence. Aaron reveals that he does not intend to disrupt the black-to-prison pipeline, but instead endorses a system for those young people who can be reasonable enough to be kept inside. So when we talk about who's on the inside and who's on the outside, this is a logic of who is considered reasonable. Who is considered reasonable enough to be kept on the inside, and who is considered unreasonable and thus in need of expulsion. And this is a political decision, right? Aaron is deciding who it's a power relation. The school, and specifically the principal, decides who is reasonable enough and who isn't. It's his definition of reasonability, of reasonableness. And so in this instant, carceral progressivism is enacted by a school leader calling on police violence to criminalize the border between the institution and the neighborhood, criminalizing the border between the progressive us and the outside. And here's just this beautiful quote articulating this politics of who is considered reasonable. Again, who is considered reasonable is a power relation. It matters who gets to decide. And the dynamic that we see in this chapter is that the principal decides who is reasonable. The principal decides what counts as respectful and not disrespectful, and the students don't. And the principal's definition of reasonableness, of respect, of proper behavior is what governs the system of who is expelled, who is allowed to participate, who is allowed to be within the inside, who is expulsed to the outside, literally. And so there's this dynamic where he's talking to a student, and she's complaining that he's not listening. And he keeps saying, I spend a lot of time listening to you. We spend a lot of time trying to help you. And the idea that Sanjay points out here is that democratic horizontal governance is revealed as a treat. It's a privilege. It's a privilege for those who are deemed reasonable enough to be on the inside, and not those who the power structure deems unreasonable enough to be on the inside and expulses to the outside. Now, I want to stop here for a second and just say this is exactly how democratic governance works, not just in the progressive school, but in the larger nation state, right? This is what prisons function to do, right? Is they are a mechanism by which the status quo determines what kinds of behaviors is reasonable and incarcerates people who are not reasonable. Mental asylums, mental health hospitals are similarly institutions that function to enclose people who are deemed unreasonable by the status quo. So Aaron keeps saying that he's spending too much time listening, as if being listened to is an indulgence rather than a right. And the idea here, right, is that Aaron is saying who is reasonable, who is unreasonable, as the base, and that this, what Sanjay is calling a recourse to rationality or reasonableness, or an earnest exchange of ideas, is the basis of democracy. Right? This is the idea of democracy, is an exchange of ideas between reasonable, rational citizens. And her point is that these ideas of reason are themselves foundational logics of late liberalism used to normalize differential distribution of suffering. More simply put, this idea of reason is itself founded on anti-black racism. The idea that some people's suffering is not recognizable according to status quo definitions of reasonability. It's like basically we're talking about sea lioning. Basically, Aaron is sea lioning the fuck out of everyone, coming in and demanding that everyone else be reasonable, and saying they're not being reasonable and rational and not engaging in this debate, this kind of civil debate at the core of democracy, and then expelling people for it. There's also a lovely quote: in the carceral progressive regime, blackness manifests as an in excess. Black children's stuff can only be extra, their voices, their behavior, the discipline that they face. So not only are we looking at the silencing of black women as being unreasonable, but we're also looking at a kind of foundation of the nation state as a system of governance that's premised on exactly this logic of who gets considered reasonable and who is considered unreasonable, and whose suffering gets discounted because they are outside of these racialized and gendered logics of who gets considered reasonable. Chapter 7 is the conclusion. We can come back to some of these concepts later, but I love Sanjay's discussion of member checks and ethnographic afterlives. A member check is basically she sent chapters and work she was writing before publishing it to the people she was writing about, and they gave her feedback, and she took that into consideration, which is a really interesting ethical practice that has emerged recently in anthropology, and I think a good one in a lot of ways. But Sanjay is actually a little critical of it based on her experience, which I'll come to in just a moment. And she articulates this idea of ethnographic afterlives, the idea that even when she's done writing the text, people continue to use it in unexpected ways, including people at Robeson. And so an ethnographic afterlife is a way of naming the kinds of social uses that people put the ethnographic text to, far beyond Sanjay's own control. So one example is she sends the principal, Aaron, a book chapter that she's been working on. And he ends up citing it in bad faith or misciting it in a way that weaponizes it against another teacher, an activist, basically saying that she shouldn't be doing this activist work and that's not appropriate. And he uses this this chapter written by Sanjay as a PhD to reinforce his interpretation. Never mind that Sanjay says, well, he actually radically misinterpreted and misunderstood my argument, and then mobilized what was supposed to be a black feminist critique to silence black women activists. And in the aftermath of that, right, she writes another piece that actually talks about this contradiction, this unexpected use of her writing to silence a black activist. And she sends it to this black activist, Sahar. I'm sorry, I'm misremembering her name. Zahra. And the response she gets back from Zahra is it was healing, that reading this second piece was healing because Sanjay had taken that moment and made something more out of it. So it wasn't just a moment of being silenced and being silenced by an authority, but rather it came to mean something more. And I love this idea that ethnography can both be weaponized, but it can also be healing. And that's a really interesting contradiction that I want to sit with more on next, when we come back and talk in person on Thursday. The other afterlife discussed in this chapter is sending a draft of Why Can't We Learn African to Sophia. And I just loved Sophia's response, in which not only does she love reading it because she loves remembering the students who she struggled with but remembers so lovingly, but then also goes on to think, how do we think about ongoing school reforms, thinking about the ways in which these reforms will now give students at least, quote unquote, the illusion of choice, but really just feeling this idea that of the carcerality of the school, the idea that the school is a place of captivity and enclosure. How do we get away from that? And as she says, it's a double bind, right? Like, she's stuck. And this is another question I want to leave y'all with. Is there a way out of the double bind? Keeping in mind, of course, I'm here in the double bind too as your professor. This is not an abstract question, is it? This is the exact kinds of relations that you and I have right now. So for the discussion forum posts, I'd like you to do the speculative anthropology exercise, focus on that. My goal is to help y'all start envisioning abolitionist futures as a way of breaking out of this progressivist imperative, because it is so easy to keep falling back on that progressive imperative. And as y'all noticed in class, even as I continued to do it, I kept falling back on this idea like, oh, my friends and I couldn't start a commune because we didn't have the capital. And that was a perspective that was lovingly critiqued in a very good way, in an important way. And so we're constantly falling back on this imperative, on this progressive imperative, because it is our cultural frameworks, our cultural norms and expectations. It's the air we breathe. And we have to really push ourselves to be consistent in an abolitionist critique and vision that does more than fall back on the same kinds of anti-black structures that we're trying to critique and move beyond. Alternatively, pull out and discuss quotes from the book that you found particularly insightful or provoking. And on Wednesday, we're going to talk about the readings assigned for that day, and we're going to talk about the book as a whole a little bit. I'm working on an assignment for that. All right, and I'll see you guys Wednesday.